He's invisible. To the hurried footsteps splashing muddy water near his threadbare blanket, he's nothing. To the loud merchants hawking shimmering fabrics and steaming pies, he's just a shadow, a smudge of gray against the grimy cobblestones. He's a shivering ghost, a memory of warmth that faded long ago. On his blanket, arranged with a heartbreaking precision that no one bothers to notice, are his treasures, his family, his life. A small wooden soldier, its paint chipped and one arm missing. A knitted bird with a loose yarn for a tail. A smooth, gray stone that fits perfectly in a small claw. He's a dragon hatchling, no bigger than a human toddler, and he's selling his soul, one piece at a time, just to see the next sunrise. Today, the choice is excruciating. His stomach is a hollow, aching cavern. The cold has sunk deep into his bones, a relentless predator that gnaws and bites. He looks at the wooden soldier, Sir Reginald, who's fought 1,000 imaginary battles by his side. He looks at the bird Pip, whose silent felt songs have been his only comfort in the lonely dark. Today the world will take one of them from him, and in return he'll get a stale piece of bread. This is his existence, a slow, quiet tearing apart on a cold street corner where no one knows his name. For the little dragon, the world doesn't wake with a sunrise, but with a shudder. Huddled in the cramped darkness of a forgotten alleyway, his day begins when the cold becomes unbearable. It's a physical weight that settles on his thin scales and refuses to leave. As he unfurls his small body from a tight protective ball, his muscles scream in protest. The hunger is already there, a familiar gnawing emptiness that's been his constant companion for as long as he can remember. He can't recall a time before the cold, or a time before the hunger. Vague, dreamlike images sometimes flicker in his mind, a warm weight beside him. A deep, rumbling sound that felt like safety, but they're like smoke, vanishing the moment he tries to grasp them. All he knows for certain is this alley, the rough brick against his back, and the crushing loneliness. He has a routine, a ritual of survival. First, he checks on his family. They're tucked into a small, grimy satchel, the one possession he has that he will never, ever sell. Carefully, he lays them out on the dirty ground. There's Sir Reginald, the one-armed soldier, whose stoic face gives him courage. There's Pip, the knitted bird, whose softness reminds him of a comfort he can't quite name. And there's Glimmer, a shard of blue glass, smoothed by time and countless anxious rubs of his thumbclaw. It catches the meager light and throws it back, a tiny, defiant star in the gloom. These three are all that remain. There were others once, a stuffed bear with one button I'd traded for a half-eaten apple, a little cart with a wobbly wheel, sold for a warm, sweet drink that made his head fuzzy for a few blissful hours. Each sale was a wound. Each lost friend left a scar on his tiny heart. Today's inventory is perilously small. He has only 3 pieces left to sell from his 4 trade pile. A bent metal tin that once held sweets, a skillfully braided leather cord, and a small carved wooden wolf. He knows the wolf will fetch the highest price. It's beautifully made, a relic from that other, forgotten life. The thought of parting with it makes his throat tighten. He packs his satchel, placing Sir Reginald, Pip and Glimmer safely inside. Their familiar weight a small anchor in the turbulent sea of his fear. The items for sale are wrapped in a separate cloth. The journey to his spot is a gauntlet. The city is a beast of stone and noise and hurrying giants. He's learned to be small and silent, to press himself into doorways and shadows to avoid the crushing press of bodies and the indifferent cruelty of wagon wheels. The smells are a form of torture. Savory meat from one stall, sweet pastries from another, all impossibly out of reach. Finally, he reaches his corner, a small, unclaimed patch of pavement between a bustling bakery and a noisy blacksmith. The location is strategic. The warmth from the bakery's vent offers a small mercy, and the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer is a steady heartbeat in the chaos. He unrolls his patchwork blanket and arranges his 3 items with the meticulous care of a master jeweler. The tin box, polished with his sleeve. The braided cord, coiled neatly. The wooden wolf, placed in the center, its noble face looking out at the world that ignores him, and then he waits. He makes himself as small as possible, wrapping his tail around his legs, trying to conserve every scrap of heat. People hurry past. A river of legs and cloaks and loud voices talking of important things, shipments, politics, loves and losses. They don't see the tiny creature at their feet, whose entire world has shrunk to 3 objects on a dirty blanket. Sometimes, a child points, their curiosity a brief, painful spark before a parent pulls him away with a stern word about vagrants. Sometimes, someone kicks his blanket by accident, scattering his wares, and doesn't even notice. With each passing hour, his hope grinds away. The cold seeps deeper. The hunger becomes a sharp, stabbing pain. He clutches the hidden satchel, feeling the familiar shapes of Sir Reginald and Pip through the cloth. He isn't alone, not completely. But as the sky darkens and the crowds begin to thin, despair sets in. Today, no one wants what he has. Tonight, the hunger will win. Arthur was a creature of habit. Every day after his shift at the city archives, he took the long way home. His small apartment was quiet, filled with the ghosts of a wife's laughter and a son's energy, and he was in no hurry to return to its echoing silence. The longer route took him through the market district, a chaotic symphony of life that usually distracted him, but today, something broke through the familiar noise. It wasn't a sound, but a stillness, a pocket of profound, heartbreaking stillness in the middle of the torrent. He stopped, pretending to inspect a cart of winter apples, his eyes drawn to a small, huddled shape on the ground. At first he thought it was a bundle of rags, but then it moved. A tiny, scaled head lifted, and two enormous golden eyes, ancient, with a sorrow no child should ever know, met his for a split second before quickly looking away. Arthur saw that it was a dragon hatchling, a creature of myth and fire, reduced to a shivering waif on a cold street. The shock was a physical jolt. Dragons were legends, creatures of the high mountains, fiercely protective and rarely seen. What in the world was a baby doing here, alone? Then he saw the blanket, the pathetic, carefully arranged display of trinkets, a tin box, a cord, a small wooden wolf, and Arthur understood. The breath caught in his throat. The child was selling his belongings. He wasn't begging or crying out. He was conducting a silent, desperate transaction with a world that refused to see him. Arthur watched as a portly merchant strode past and kicked the edge of the blanket, sending the little wolf skittering across the stones. The man didn't even break stride. The hatchling flinched, a movement so small it was almost imperceptible, and waited until the man was gone before scrambling to retrieve his possession, his small claws making a frantic scratching sound on the ground. He brushed the dirt from the wolf with meticulous care before placing it back. A cold, sharp fury rose in Arthur's chest. He looked at the faces in the crowd, indifferent, annoyed, preoccupied. No one else saw, or if they did, they chose not to. They saw a pest, a nuisance, a spot of dirt. They did not see a child. Arthur stayed for nearly an hour, pretending to browse, his attention never wavering from the small dragon. He saw the subtle tremors that shook the child's body. He saw the way the golden eyes darted towards the bakery every time the door opened, a wave of warm bread-scented air washing over the street. He saw the hope in those eyes flicker and dim with each person who walked by. He thought of his own son Leo, taken by a fever 5 winters ago. He remembered Leo's fierce attachment to a stuffed lion, how he would cry if it was misplaced for even a moment. The thought of his son having to sell that lion for a piece of bread was a physical agony, a phantom limb of grief that ached with a sudden violent intensity. He had to do something, but what? Simply giving the child money felt wrong. It felt like charity, and the child's dignified posture spoke of a pride Arthur didn't want to wound. This wasn't a beggar. This was a merchant. An idea began to form. He was a man who understood the value of things, not just their monetary value, but their story. And he could see that these weren't just trinkets. They were memories. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and started to walk, not towards home, but towards the little dragon. He would meet the child on his own terms. He would honor the transaction. Arthur approached slowly, deliberately, not wanting to startle a child who seemed as fragile as spun glass. He stopped a few feet from the blanket, casting a long shadow as the sun dipped behind the buildings. The little dragon sensed him, his head snapping up. Fear flashed in his wide, golden eyes. He flattened himself against the ground, tail curling tightly, as if trying to take up less space in the universe. He was bracing for a kick, a shout, an order to move along. But Arthur did none of those things. He simply crouched down, bringing himself to the child's level, a gesture of respect utterly foreign to the little dragon's experience. He met the fearful gaze with quiet kindness. "Hello there," Arthur said, his voice soft. "What are you selling?" The dragon swallowed hard. With a trembling claw, he pushed the wooden wolf forward an inch. "Toys," he whispered, his voice a dry, unused scratch. "For trade." Arthur looked at the wolf. He saw the care in its carving, the way the ears were worn smooth by the constant, comforting touch of a small thumb. This wasn't just a toy. This was a friend. "He's magnificent," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "How much?" The hatchling hesitated, his eyes clouded with calculations of hunger and worth. He named a pittance, barely enough for a loaf of die-old bread. He expected Arthur to haggle, to scoff, to walk away. Instead, Arthur reached into his coat and pulled out a small pouch. He counted out several coins, far more than the child had asked for, and placed them gently on the blanket. The dragon stared at the silver, unable to process what was happening. It's too much," he stammered, trying to push the coins back. "I must trade fair." A gentle, sad smile touched Arthur's lips. "It's worth it to me," he said firmly. Then he reached into another pocket and pulled out a small paper-wrapped package. "I bought this for my supper," he lied softly, "but I find I'm not very hungry. Would you like it?" He unwrapped the paper, revealing a warm, savory meat pie. The scent wafted over, and the little dragon's stomach betrayed him with a loud, desperate growl. Shame burned in his cheeks, and he quickly looked down. "Please," Arthur said gently. "It will just go to waste otherwise." The dragon looked from the pie, to the coins, to Arthur's kind, patient face. Nothing in his short, brutal life had prepared him for this. Kindness was a foreign language. He slowly, tentatively reached out and took the pie. It was warm. The warmth seeped into his cold scales. A shocking, wonderful sensation. He took a hesitant bite, The flavor exploded in his mouth, rich, savory, real. It was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. He ate the entire pie in a few desperate gulps, not realizing tears were streaming down his face, washing clean streaks through the grime on his cheeks when he finished. He looked up at Arthur, his heart a storm of gratitude and bewilderment. Arthur hadn't taken the wolf. He simply picked up the coins he had offered and pressed them into the dragon's small claw, closing the child's fingers around them. "Keep your friend," he said softly, nodding at the wolf. "The pie was a gift, and this is for another day." He stood, gave a small nod, and walked away, disappearing back into the river of people. The little dragon sat on his blanket, the warmth of the pie spreading through his belly, the impossible weight of coins in his claw, and the even more impossible weight of a stranger's kindness settling in his chest. For the first time in a very long time he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. And it was the most terrifying and most wonderful feeling in the world. Arthur returned the next day, and the day after that, he never approached the blanket again, never made the child feel pressured. Instead, he'd buy a hot drink or a warm roll and simply leave it on the edge of the blanket with a quiet good day before moving on. He became a silent, dependable presence in the dragon's life. A fact. The hatchling, whose name Arthur learned was Ash, slowly began to lose the rigid fear that defined him. He would look up when Arthur approached, a flicker of something other than terror in his golden eyes. He never spoke, but a silent understanding grew between them. Then, the weather turned. The gray autumn sky, threatening for weeks, finally broke. It started as a cold, biting rain that soaked through Ash's thin rags in minutes. Soon, the rain began to freeze, turning into a cruel, stinging sleet. The warmth from the bakery vent was no match for the icy wind that whipped through the street. Arthur, watching from a sheltered awning, felt his heart clench. Ash was shivering violently, his small body curled into a tight ball, his scales offering no protection. He had wrapped his blanket around himself, but it was soaked through and useless. Arthur knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the sleet, that the child would not survive a night like this. All the good reasons to not get involved, the rules, the danger, his own quiet life, they all turned to dust. He crossed the street and knelt beside the miserable bundle. "Ash," he said, his voice firm but gentle. The bundle stirred, and two huge, terrified eyes looked up at him. "You can't stay here," Arthur said. "You'll freeze. Please, let me take you somewhere warm, just for the night." He held out his hand, palm up, an open invitation. Ash stared at the hand. A human hand, a hand from a species that had only ever shown him indifference or cruelty. His instincts screamed at him to run, to hide. But then he looked at Arthur's face. He saw the genuine worry in his eyes. He felt the memory of the warm pie, the hot drinks, the quiet kindness that asked for nothing in return. His body was racked with a shudder so violent it felt like he was breaking apart. He was so cold, so tired. He couldn't face another night shivering in the dark, wondering if he would ever feel warm again. With a movement so small it was a surrender. He took one tentative step forward, then another. He walked right up to Arthur's outstretched hand and, after a moment's hesitation, pressed his head against it. The contact was electric. Arthur felt the child's rough, cold scales and the frantic trembling that shook his tiny frame. "It's all right," Arthur whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You're safe now." Without another word, he gently unbuttoned his large overcoat. "Come on, inside here. It's warmer." Ash, moving as if in a dream, crawled into the dark woolen space. Arthur buttoned the coat back up, creating a small warm cave against his body. He could feel the dragon's shivering form pressed against his chest. He carefully gathered the worn blanket and the few remaining toys, tucking them away and leaving nothing behind. The journey was a blur for Ash. He was enveloped in darkness, muffled sounds, and the scent of wool and something else, something that smelled like books and quiet safety. The rhythmic rocking of Arthur's stride was surprisingly soothing. For the first time he could remember, he wasn't cold. The steady, strong beat of the man's heart against his ear was a lullaby. He was terrified, but underneath the terror was a tiny, growing seed of trust. He had made a choice. He had stepped out of the shadows and into this man's coat. Whatever happened next, it would be different. The thought was both the most frightening and most hopeful he had ever had. The first thing Ash noticed was the silence. After the constant clamor of the market, the quiet of Arthur's apartment was a physical presence, punctuated only by the crackle of a fire and the soft ticking of a clock. The second thing he noticed was the warmth. It wasn't the fleeting warmth of a bakery vent. It was a deep, pervasive warmth that seemed to soak into the very air. Arthur gently unbuttoned his coat and Ash blinked, his eyes adjusting to the soft, golden light. He was in a space filled with towering shelves of books, a worn but comfortable-looking armchair, and a hearth where a cheerful fire danced. It was a cave of warmth and light. "Here we are," Arthur said softly, feeling the little dragon trembling against him. "You're safe here, I promise." Arthur prepared a basin of warm water in front of the fire. Ash flinched, his memories of icy rain still fresh, but Arthur's movements were slow and reassuring. He dipped a soft cloth into the water and gently began to wipe the layers of grime from Ash's scales. The water was warm, not shocking. The cloth was soft, not abrasive. As Arthur cleaned him, Ash felt layers of misery being washed away with the dirt after his bath. Arthur wrapped him in a thick, soft towel and sat with him in the armchair by the fire. The feeling of the soft fabric against his clean scales was a luxury beyond imagining. The steady heat baked the last of the cold from his bones, and a deep sleepiness began to creep over him. But Arthur wasn't done. He returned from another room with a bowl. It wasn't scraps. It was a warm, thick stew with tender chunks of meat and vegetables. The smell alone made Ash's mouth water. He ate slowly this time, savoring each spoonful Arthur gently offered. It was a real meal, meant to nourish, not just to keep starvation at bay. When he finished, his small stomach was full and content for the first time in his life. Finally, Arthur retrieved Ash's own worn blanket, which he had dried by the fire. He also brought out Sir Reginald, Pip, and the wooden wolf, laying them on a soft cushion by the hearth. Then he added one more thing. From a shelf, he took down a small knitted line with a soft yarn mane. It was old and well-loved. "This was my son's," Arthur said quietly. "His name was Leo, I think. I think he would want you to have it." He placed the lion next to Ash. It was soft and clean and smelled of home. Ash reached out a tentative claw and touched its mane. He looked at the lion, then at his own small, battered family. He looked at the crackling fire, felt the warmth of the cushions, the comfortable fullness in his belly. He looked up at Arthur's kind, tired face. This place, this man, this feeling. He didn't have a word for it, but his small, weary heart was beginning to understand. For 3 days Ash lived in a state of suspended disbelief. He had his own soft bed by the fire. Warm meals appeared as if by magic. The terrifying world outside was held at bay by sturdy walls. Arthur moved around him with a quiet grace, reading for hours in his armchair, the rustle of turning pages becoming a comforting rhythm. He never pushed, never demanded anything. He simply created a space of absolute safety and waited. Ash, for his part, remained wary. He stayed close to the fire, his collection of toys now including the yarn lion always within reach. He watched Arthur with large, intelligent eyes, trying to understand this strange, gentle giant. His wild instincts were still screaming that this was a trap, that the kindness was a lie. On the third evening, a fierce winter storm raged outside, rattling the wind. But inside, the apartment was an island of peace. The fire crackled merrily and Arthur was humming a soft tune as he mended a tear in his shirt. Ash watched him. He saw the way Arthur's large hands moved with surprising delicacy. He saw the gentle concentration on his face. This man, who could have crushed him, was instead mending cloth. This man, who lived in this warm, safe cave, had opened his door to a stray and offered him shelter from the storm, both outside and in. Something inside Ash, a knot of fear and mistrust clenched tight for his entire life, finally began to loosen. The warmth of the room was nothing compared to the warmth blooming in his chest. He stood up from his cushion. He took a step, then another, his claws silent on the thick rug. He crossed the space that separated them, a gulf far wider than a few feet of carpet. Arthur stopped humming, sensing the movement. He remained perfectly still, not wanting to spook the child. Ash reached the armchair. He stood there for a long moment, his body trembling not from cold, but from the monumental effort of this single act. He looked at Arthur's leg, and then he leaned forward and gently rested his head against Arthur's knee. The contact was feather-light, but for Arthur it was like a lightning strike. It was a declaration, a surrender, an acceptance, a profound statement of trust, earned through patience and simple kindness. Arthur slowly, carefully, lowered his hand and placed it on Ash's small, scaled back. He felt the delicate bones, the gentle rise and fall of the child's breathing. Ash didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch, letting out a soft, rumbling sound deep in his chest. It wasn't a growl. It was the sound of a creature who, after a lifetime of hardship, had finally, impossibly, found his way home. Every day, countless souls, as vulnerable and forgotten as Ash, are waiting on their own cold street corners. They wait in shelters, in alleys, and in the shadows, waiting for their Arthur. If this story has touched your heart, consider reaching out to your local animal shelter or rescue organization. A small act of kindness, a donation, or the gift of a forever home can rewrite a story from one of hardship to one of hope. The sound of a purring dragon became the new heart of the quiet apartment. The days that followed were a montage of gentle healing. Ash learned the joy of play, chasing a string Arthur dangled by the fire, his movements growing more joyful with each passing hour. He learned that toys were not for selling, but for loving. He would sleep curled up at the foot of Arthur's bed, the yarn lion tucked under his chin, no longer needing to keep one eye open for danger. He learned that a home isn't just a place with a roof, but a place where you are safe, warm, and unconditionally loved. Arthur, in turn, found the echoing silence of his apartment filled with a quiet, profound sense of purpose. The ghosts of his past hadn't vanished, but they were now joined by a small, living, breathing reason to look towards the future. And often, in the quiet of the evening, the man and the dragon would simply sit together by the fire, two solitary souls who had found in each other an unlikely and unbreakable family.